Thank you very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure to be here this evening and particularly to support the work of AWARE, and indeed some of the work that I will talk about that we've done has been in collaboration with AWARE. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about challenging stigma to improve mental health in young people. What I'm going to talk about are the findings of research and peer-reviewed research, but what I've done, because I know at this time of day it's not great to be looking at slides that have loads of people's names and stuff like that, I have removed names from this so that you've got more an easy view set of slides with images, but I'm more than happy to email the full PowerPoint presentation to anybody who'd like it, and you'll get all the full set of references with that. So, as I say, it was done for aesthetic reasons for this evening, but I'm very happy to share all of the references with anybody who'd like them. So what I'm doing is I'm going to structure the presentation around a series of questions. Unfortunately, I'm going to give rather imperfect answers to most of these questions, but I'm still going to structure the talk around them. So starting off by saying a little bit about why would we focus particularly on young people? Then the question on whether stigma definitely exists with young people. How would tackling stigma help mental health? Do we know anything about how it can be tackled? And what do we know at the moment about how much young people know about mental health? So I'm going to work my way through each of those in turn. And as I say, unfortunately, many of my answers to these questions are somewhat imperfect. So why focus on young people? And young people is in the title of my presentation this evening, and it's young people that I work with, and I work in the School of Psychology in UCD, and within that I work with a number of colleagues in what we call the Youth Mental Health Lab. That's just a group of collaborating psychology researchers who do work on a variety of different aspects of mental health. Well, the reason for focusing on mental health is that we know from the international research that adolescence and early adulthood are particularly vulnerable times for the emergence of mental health problems. So if you look over the course of the lifespan at where mental health problems are most likely to emerge, then you will see that it starts in about adolescence, peaks in the early 20s, continues on for a while, and then drops off. So it is a time of vulnerability. And it's a time of vulnerability for a number of very clear reasons, most of which have their origins in our brains. So the brain is effectively rewiring itself over the course of adolescence. So we know from the very recent studies using techniques such as MRI scanners, using EEGs, that if you compare the wiring within the brain before and after adolescence, you see lots and lots of change. So, for example, the number of connections between different parts of the brain changes. The connections between some areas greatly increase, the connections between other areas decrease. We see the relative number of connections in different parts of the brain change. So this is manifests sometimes in changes in the amount of grey and white matter within the brain. We also know that before adolescence, some parts of the brain light up for particular stimuli. So, for example, if you see somebody who's distressed or upset, prior to adolescence, typically what lights up in the child's brain is an emotional reaction, the part of the brain that responds to emotion. If you look at it in an adolescent or someone after adolescence, you see far more activity going on or more lighting up in the part of the brain that is thinking, that's cognitively analysing the situation. And of course, that's very important, because if every time somebody got upset, all you did was get upset in response, you wouldn't be able to help them. So in fact, it's a very positive change. As we get older, we begin to think about a situation, and that in turn can help us to help somebody else who's in a difficult situation. So the brain itself is changing, it's rewiring. And of course, every time you rejig the wiring of something, just as if you changed the wiring in your house, there's potential for things to go wrong within that system. But of course, the brain also is at the basis of a lot of other changes that are happening over the course of adolescence. The main one that we're all aware of is puberty. It's very obvious, and yet at the same time, I think for adults, it can be very, very easy to forget what it was like to be a teenager, what it was like to inhabit a body that looks completely different than it did this time last year, to be growing at a great rate, to have the shape of your body changing, to have a face that suddenly has spots on it when you used to have a face that was free of blemishes, and as well to be increasingly self-conscious. So puberty you really have to try to imagine yourself back to that point at which you became a really self-conscious individual, where you began to be aware that people were looking at you, and to feel bad about that. So puberty brings with it a whole lot of physical changes, and it brings with it a whole lot of psychological changes in response to those physical changes. Also powered by the brain is that after adolescence, or with the change to adolescence, people become able to do much what I will, as a developmental psychologist, I would call higher order thinking. Now, by that, all I mean is to think in more abstract ways, to think about things that could be done differently. Whereas young children typically accept the world the way it is. Most children of 8 or 9 are absolutely confident that they have the best parents in the world. There is no doubt in their mind. Very few teenagers think that. Now, part of that is, of course, that teenagers can suddenly imagine that their parents might be different. They might actually behave towards them in a different way, a way that they would prefer, whereas young children don't do that. So teenagers, adolescents are able to think about the world in new ways, and that causes them to question the world as they experience it now, the world of relationships that they have, and so on. So altogether, these changes, the changes in the brain within itself, the changes the brain affects our body through puberty, our higher order thinking, are all changes that are probably feeding into the greater vulnerability that exists for mental health problems over the course of adolescence. The other big change is not one that's really linked into the brain per se, but that is a big social change. So if you think about it, before adolescence, most of our support, and in fact most of our social lives, are very much focused on our families. So you expect to be doing things at the weekend with your mum and dad. They're organising things for you. If somebody's coming round to your house to play, it's your parents have organised it. But your parents are also there for you if there's a problem. You know, your mum or your dad hopefully is the person that you know you can turn to for almost anything that can go wrong in your life. But of course, that begins to change at adolescence because suddenly you start to look to your peer group much more. So you definitely look to your peer group more for your social life. So you probably now resent it if your mum and dad are very keen to have you involved in an activity at the weekend, because what you'd much prefer to be doing is going out with your friends. But it also means that there may be things now that you don't actually want to talk to your parents about, things you may want support for. So boyfriend, girlfriend, something that's happened in school that you're not entirely confident you want to tell your parents about, or you'd rather check it out with a friend first. So suddenly there is a change in the kind of social support that you have and the social life that you have. And of course, some people won't transition easily from a family-focused social life to a peer-focused social life, so that can leave you vulnerable. If you don't find friends who are good social supports for you, that leaves you vulnerable too. So in social terms as well, adolescence is a vulnerable time. The other point I would mention, just in passing, and it's something that I think probably feeds into this, and that is that society's views of adolescents are very different from their views of children. So if you think about it, if you look at what's in the papers or what's on television or generally how we think about children, children are nice, they're cute, they're friendly, they're pleasant, they show you nice things, and if anything, information in the press on children and so on tends to hype up that cuteness, maybe says a little bit about vulnerability. But I think if you were to look through the newspapers or magazines for stuff about teenagers and children, you'll see that they've lost the cute factor. Suddenly, they are a group that really is seen as problematic. When you think of teenagers, you think of drinking problems, you think of teenage pregnancy maybe, you think of getting into trouble. So that's a change of your place within society. So where before society put you as vulnerable and needing to be looked after, sometimes you can now be viewed more as a threat to society, and that may also be feeding into this mix. So all of that change makes it very unsurprising that a lot of literature, and worldwide now, not just in Ireland, suggests that there is a greater prevalence of mental health problems in the adolescent years. So this is just a slide I've taken from the My World survey, which was a very large survey of young people, both in secondary school and in university, and young people in the workplace in Ireland. This was done by my colleague Barbara Dooley and Amanda Fitzgerald, also in the Youth Mental Health Lab in UCD. And this is just a slide taken on depression. And this shows you the data that's drawn from secondary schools in Ireland. And you can see that, as you might expect, the vast majority of the secondary school pupils didn't have problems with depression. So you can see here the highest bars are for those who had no problem. But you've got quite a number have mild problems. But if you were to look, and so very few have very severe problems, but nonetheless, if you combine moderate, severe, and very severe, you can see that there is a reasonable proportion of young people have got high levels of symptoms of depression in this study. And this was a very large study indeed. Now, this is an age group that's slightly younger, but it's another Irish study. The reason why I'm bringing it in, even though I know that 11 to 13-year-olds are not normally within the interest group for AWARE, and they're pretty well prior to many of the problems around depression. But nonetheless, I mention this because this is a study that didn't just look at self-reported symptoms. This actually looked at full diagnosis. And this looked at a group of 11 to 13-year-olds and found that 27% of them had a diagnosable mental health problem. So really we're seeing that mental health problems are extremely common from early adolescence right through the teenage years and on into adulthood. Now, we also know, unfortunately, that having a mental health problem, while being enough of a challenge in itself to cope with, can also bring with it a lot of negative responses from other people around you. And I'm putting together these negative experiences and calling them stigma. Until relatively recently, the term stigma wasn't actually ever applied to children, but we have started to use it because we think that it links into what we know about the stigma of mental health problems in in adulthood. So the next few slides are drawn from studies that I've been involved with my mostly with my PhD students, and so this slide is a quotation from a young person who was influenced by Lynn McCaig, who's one of my PhD students. And Lynn asked young people about their experiences of having a mental health problem. So this young person had a diagnosed internalizing mental health problem. And she reported that one of her friends had told her that she thinks people who get help for mental health problems are kind of weird. So an immediate negative reaction, meaning that you'd be unlikely to turn to somebody like that for support if you yourself had got a mental health problem. Another young man that Lynn interviewed said, there was one person that found out about my mental health problem and they kept mocking me because of it. So here it's going beyond simply saying that you think someone with a mental health problem is weird into actually using it as the basis for teasing or for getting at somebody. So, and we have a lot of evidence like that from people who have been interviewed about their experiences. We also know from big international meta-analytic studies. So a meta-analysis is a study that simply combines the findings of lots of other studies in order to have a really large sample size and therefore to be able to make more powerful conclusions. So this large meta-analysis found that where studies reported levels of victimization in groups with different types of problems, anything from physical disabilities through health problems, through mental health problems, they found that those who had mental health problems such as anxiety, depression, or other affective disorders were significantly more likely to have been victimized within their peer group. So this is a very powerful finding because it is a combination of findings from a lot of other studies. So this is based on reports of young people being victimized. Now, within my research group, we also do quite a lot of work with young people in which we present them with stories about a fictionalized person. And this fictional person we will describe with, say, the symptoms of depression or the symptoms of maybe a psychotic disorder or some other mental health problem. And we ask the young people taking part in our study for their responses to this young person. We do this to find out a little bit more about how they react to people with mental health problems. And what we found is that story characters where they are described as having symptoms of depression are typically rated by the young people in our studies as having lower social status. So they think that these would not be very popular kids that everybody wants to hang out with. And when we ask the young people in our studies, is this somebody you'd be friends with or somebody that you would work on a project with or somebody that you would pick to be on your team, they typically say that they wouldn't. They wouldn't want to be with them. We also have found by comparing story characters with different types of problems that depression, particularly in teenagers, tends to be viewed more negatively than ADHD, which is another common mental health problem that we have often presented to young people. So that's another element of the evidence of the negativity that can be directed against young people with mental health problems. So this stigma exists, and I think there's more and more evidence to support that. So the next question to ask is, if you did something about stigma, so say we could work to reduce that stigma, say we could make it easier to be a young person with a mental health problem, could we make it easier for you to integrate with your peer group, to find a supportive peer group, and so on? How would that help with mental health problems? Well, there are many different ways, but the one that I want to really highlight is that we know that people who hold stigmatizing attitudes, in other words, people who themselves believe that they do not want to have anything to do with someone who's got a mental health problem, who wouldn't want to associate with them, or if you're in school, who wouldn't want to work on a project with them, they themselves are at risk. And they are at risk because we know that having high levels of stigma is associated with not intending to seek help if you have a problem. Now, that makes a huge amount of sense. If I think that I want to have nothing to do with people who have mental health problems, why would I look for help if I think that that's going to make me have a diagnosis of being somebody with a mental health problem? So it's really important that we tackle stigma, not just for the sake of the people who are being stigmatized, but also because those people who stigmatize may be at risk themselves because they are unlikely to seek help if they themselves had any kind of mental health problem. There are numerous studies which have demonstrated this. The men in the audience tonight, you may know you are slightly more vulnerable to this type of belief system according to research findings. So that studies with men in the general population suggest that men, but not women, with this higher level of stigma towards mental health problems are the ones who are likely to report that they would not seek help even if they thought that they needed it. Within studies of college students, the evidence here is that both men and women in college who believe that, who have negative attitudes towards mental health problems, they are much more likely to say that they would not seek help. So again, this is suggesting that stigma is related to not looking for help, and that in turn is clearly a problem. Because what we need is people to be open to seeking help, because for so many of the problems that young people face, we know that early intervention is likely to produce the best outcome. So if it's possible that we could help to change stigma, how would we go about doing it? Now, so there are lots of different ways have been looked at within the literature. Surprisingly, few of these have been explored with adolescents. There's been a lot of interest in how you can change stigma in the general population. So you've probably all seen ads on television that are designed to reduce stigma, and public mental health information is one way in which you might try it. That's rarely targeted specifically at young people. So I want to focus instead here in saying a little bit about education programs. And there have been multiple education programs that have been developed. With adults, these have been found to be quite effective if they have certain criteria. There are far fewer with young people. However, there's some reason to be hopeful. So this, again, the two findings that I've put up here are not from any one study. These are from another one of these meta-analytic studies, which have combined data from a number of other studies. So in other words, they're getting even more information about the effectiveness of education. And here these studies suggest that adolescents who are taught about mental health problems, in other words, they're given information about the nature of mental health problems, what can cause them, how they can be helped, the fact that they can be overcome, that those people who get that information, and very often, though that kind of information can be combined with meeting somebody who has got a mental health problem, who can talk to them about what they've been through, how they dealt with their problem, what helped them, what didn't help them, how they're getting on with their lives. The young people who are exposed to that kind of experience have been demonstrated in some circumstances to have more positive attitudes to mental health, and so therefore they're less stigmatizing. For young people, education on its own is more effective than contact on its own. So in other words, if instead of bringing both an education package to a classroom together with somebody who's going to talk about having themselves experienced a mental health problem, you just did one of those two, well then the one to choose is education. It's not just the person coming in to talk about their mental health problem. Whereas in fact with adults, very often it's the personal experience, it's the personal story that's most effective. Unfortunately, the challenge with the information that we have about education and how effective education interventions are is that the quality of the research that has gone on here is actually not very good. And this is commented on not just in this paper, which happens to have been done by Pat Corrigan and a group of researchers in the United States, but by lots of other researchers as well. So really, for us to be confident in the effectiveness of an education intervention, we should be thinking about looking at the impact of an education intervention just as we would look at the impact of a new drug. So if you imagine that you've got a new drug that you think is going to help, say, fight cancer, what you're going to do is you're going to design a study in which some people are given the drug, some people are given a placebo or something that they are not sure if it's the drug or not, and then you see in that double-blind situation who has the best outcome. Ideally, that is what should happen with education. To be really certain that education is effective, we need to be absolutely checking it using these randomized controlled trials, as they're called, in which some people get the education package that we think works, some people get some other type of education, and then we look to measure its outcomes. Importantly, just as you would check that a drug that that's designed to treat cancer doesn't have a negative effect on people's health. So we should double check that education packages don't have a negative impact on people's mental health. So we do need much better design studies, but the research that we have at least suggests that this is an avenue that is worth exploring a bit further. So why might it be that we think education should be effective? And of course that's important because we want to not just understand whether or not it can change stigma, but we also want to understand why it might change stigma. And typically, or one of the possible reasons why it might change stigma is because of what psychologists like to call attribution theory. And attribution theory, it's actually a concept that's fairly easy to understand, even though psychologists like to wrap it up in all kinds of language that makes it less accessible. Here's a much more accessible slide. If you imagine a situation in which you are stopped at a traffic light, the light is red, you're waiting patiently for the light to go green, and the next thing is somebody crashes into you. There's a big bang and you get an awful fright, but you get over your fright and you look to the car that has bumped into you. Now, imagine one of two scenarios. Scenario one, the person in the car is fumbling around with their mobile phone, making it absolutely clear that they crashed into you because they were doing something with their mobile phone. They weren't attending to what they were doing, so they hit you because of that. How are you likely to feel in a situation like that? Yeah, you're likely to feel angry. You clearly will blame the person. They were doing something they shouldn't have been doing, and you're going to respond angrily. If, on the other hand, you look into the car and the person is slumped over the wheel, you get out of the car, you go to that person, and you see that they're clearly unconscious or having difficulty breathing, your reaction will be completely different. It will be one of sympathy. It will be one, or far more likely to be one of sympathy, and one of seeking help for that person. That's the fundamental premise of attribution theory. If someone does something that you find objectionable, in this case, bumping into your car, or maybe it's behaving in a way, certain ways because of a mental health problem, if you blame them for it, if you think they could control what they're doing, then you're far more likely to react negatively to them than if you think that they can't control what they're doing. So attribution theory would help us to find some way of understanding why education might be an effective way of helping people to overcome stigma. Because if you can understand the nature of mental health problems and how having a mental health problem is not within the control of the person, and that they may be trying extremely hard to overcome their difficulties, then you're far more likely to be a helpful person helping them. Now, we have looked at whether or not this blaming or this holding someone responsible actually seems to influence responses in teenagers, and we have found that it does. So here, this was a study that I did with some colleagues a few years ago, and what we found was that when we gave those little scenarios or those little stories that I was telling you with these characters in them, if the character in the story had a reason for why their behaviour appeared to be depressed. So if you gave, for example, some reason about something that had recently happened in their lives, the reaction to them was likely to be much more positive than if that information wasn't present. So adolescents who thought a boy with depression was responsible for his behaviour were far less likely to be accepting of him. And we found that, interestingly, older teenagers tended to have far greater belief that that person was responsible and therefore had far greater negative reactions to them. More recently, we've done another very similar study, this time with my PhD student, Louise Dolphin. Again, she found something very similar, again, that a greater level of belief that the person with depression was responsible for their behaviour, for how they behaved, that was going to mean that they were much less well accepted by the people who were reacting to them. Now, again, consistently with all this stuff that we have done on depression, gender is significant. So here in this study, Louise found that males thought of other males as being more in control, and therefore they held them more responsible for their behaviour. So they had more negative reactions, and we have found that in a number of other studies too. That may be linked into a societal thing where within our society we may think of men as having greater agency, as being very independent, able to deal with things themselves, and therefore maybe we're more likely to think of them as having control, and therefore we may generalise that subconsciously to them having control of their mood and having control of depression. So overall, it does seem that in our understanding of how young people respond to somebody with depression, that attribution theory has something to tell us. It may well be that it's telling us something about the extent to which someone is being blamed for their behaviour, for their mental health problem. So if what you know about a mental health problem is important, then the next important question to ask is, what do we know about what young people in Ireland know about mental health problems? How much do they know? So we've done, I'll tell you just about this study and then tell you about one where we've just started recently. So we did a study which we worked actually with Aware in gathering some of the data for this. So this was a study of 235 young people in the senior cycle in secondary school. That's 4th, 5th and 6th year. They read about a character who displayed symptoms of depression, and we verified these symptoms with clinical psychologists. And we asked them to say whether or not they thought the person in the story needed help. We then asked them a more difficult question. We asked them, how do you know they need help? What from the story tells you that this person needs help? So what did they say? Well, overwhelmingly, they understood that this person needed help. So the question was quite straightforward. It was yes or no. Do you think the person in this story is experiencing more than just a typical changes in mood as a teenager? And so you can see here that the vast majority, 89%, said, yes, this person needs further help. So that's a really, really strong finding. They definitely could identify that help was needed in this case. But what we had also done was we had embedded within the story a series of symptoms that Aware uses as part of its Beat the Blues education program. And within this, they have a series of statements about the kinds of changes that accompany depression. So, for example, feeling sad or anxious or bored, having low energy, feeling tired, under or oversleeping, poor concentration, loss of interest in hobbies, low self-esteem, maybe some somatic complaints, pains in the tummy or head or chest, or loss of interest in living, and most extreme here, suicidal thoughts. So each of these was embedded within the story. So in other words, in the story you read that this person had been feeling very sad recently, they were tired, they no longer felt that they had the energy to do things, they often woke up at night, and so on. You get the picture. All of these were built into the story. And what we did is we asked the young people what in the story they were able to pick up on that would told them that this person might have depression. Now here, we see that they weren't able to pick out the specifics. So each pair of lines is one of those 7, are they 7, 8, 1, 2, 3... 8. One of the 8 festival symptoms.
The yellow line, unfortunately, is that it wasn't recognised, and the blue line is that it was recognised. So you can see that, in fact, the only thing that came close to even half of the young people identifying as a way to know that somebody may be suffering from depression was the loss of interest in life and suicidal thoughts. The next most common was having negative feelings, that they would have been feeling sad or low, and then the loss of interest. Almost no insight at all into the fact that loss of energy, disrupted sleep, lack of concentration, aches and pains, that those might all be symptoms of depression too. So, yes, young people know something about what it means to be going through something that's got the symptoms of depression, but they're finding it very hard to pinpoint them. Now, to be honest, the way in which this little story was written, it was kind of hitting them over the head with a sledgehammer. We were sort of hammering home how serious the problem was. So what this says to us is that these young people really need a bit more information. They need to have some more insight to know that some of these other things can also be symptoms of depression. And indeed, from talking to some of my clinical colleagues, some of these can actually be the far more likely symptoms of depression that somebody is appearing with. So we can see here that there is certainly lots of space for further education on this. We did also look at, this is a very, very busy slide. Essentially, what we did is we compared what boys knew and what girls knew. And the short answer here is that the girls knew a little bit more than the boys, but not a huge amount. Certainly, girls were more aware of some of the symptoms of depression than the boys were. What we're hoping to do now is to look in much more detail at getting a picture of what might be changing over the course of adolescence in terms of what young people know about mental health. So this typically, what you know about mental health is now being called mental health literacy. So that's a combination of being able to identify symptoms, being able to know who to turn to for help, being able to suggest to somebody else that they may need help, and so on. So this study, we're now looking at 3 age groups. We're looking at first year in secondary school, third year and fifth years, because again, we want to see whether there is change as you get older. And after all, we know that there are lots of different modules about health being embedded within things like the social personal health education curriculum within secondary schools. We're also broadening it beyond symptom identification. So a lot of the work that has been done on mental health literacy has focused on, do you know what the symptoms of psychosis are? Do you know what the symptoms of depression are? Do you know what the symptoms of phobia are? And so on. So we're now looking broader than that. We're looking to see whether young people, for example, are able to make use of information from websites. So we've taken short passages from websites designed for young people, designed to give them information about mental health, and then we've asked them some comprehension questions about those. So we're looking to see whether they're able to absorb that information and to make use of it. We're also looking at their help-seeking intention. So we ask them whether they think they would turn to anybody if they thought they had a mental health problem, and who they turn to. And we're giving them a range of different possible people they could turn to, both through friends, family, peer group, and so on. So we're gathering a lot of information. We hope that we will have that information collected by the end of the current academic year. And again, as I say, what we're hoping to do is to then be able to present almost like a developmental account of how knowledge of mental health changes over the course of secondary school. So where does this leave us in terms of what we know about the challenges of mental health stigma today? Well, certainly we know, and this we can most confident of, that young people are vulnerable to mental health problems. That's very well established. Also, unfortunately, well established is that young people with mental health problems are likely to be stigmatized, and many of them report that they've had some very negative experiences. We know that lower levels of stigma are related to higher levels of help seeking, and so, again, that's a concern to us. And we know that education can reduce stigma and increase intentions to seek help. However, unfortunately, there are many crucial things that we still don't know. First of all, we really don't know, because of some of the limitations in the way the research has been done on education that I spoke to you about, we don't really know what are the most effective ways to reduce stigma for young people. So already we know that the way to reduce stigma in young people is probably different from that in adults, but we don't know what the most effective way is. We really do need additional research to help us find that out. We also don't know some very crucial things about education. So we know that education can reduce stigma, or we've got the inklings that it may be able to do. But all of these studies, what they do is they ask people about stigma and their intention to seek help. The really crucial thing that we need to find out is, if you reduce stigma, will you reduce people's actual help seeking? In other words, not just will they say to you, oh yeah, no, I definitely go and look for help. Will they actually pick up the phone, go to the clinic, or whatever? So we need to be absolutely, we need to get the research going that will tell us whether stigma influences the actuality of help seeking and not just the intention to seek help. And then finally, we need to know how best to ensure that services for young people are not stigmatizing. And this is crucial because, of course, stigma occurs not just at the point of thinking, will you look for help? Stigma can also be around the process of getting help. And so if there isn't a destigmatized way of looking for help, then even if you feel positive about help seeking, you may not seek help because the service may not be there for you. And so we know that there is lots of interesting work going on in this area and going on in Ireland today, so that the Jigsaw Mental Health Service is an attempt to do just that, to be a service that's welcoming for young people, that looks like a pleasant environment to go into, where you can just go in, you can meet somebody, they can talk to you. You can find help in a way that doesn't make you feel bad about yourself, that doesn't make you feel as if you're in some way inferior to your peer group, that you can feel good about. So really, simply taking away the stigma from the intention to seek help is never going to be enough. Taking away the stigma of mental health is never going to be enough. We also need to have services that in themselves are not stigmatizing and that will then be welcoming and open to people of all ages to go to. And that's it. Thank you very much.